Welcome back to Power and Market, our weekly roundtable discussion of important news of the day. I'm going to be your host today, Tho Bishop, joined not by Ryan McMakin, but by two other great members of the editorial team. We have, in his usual spot, Connor O'Keefe with his regular Wednesday column, and making his first time appearance here on Power and Market, Joshua Mawhorter, who's got our Friday morning column. Big week right now, college football week. I know, Connor, I'm sure you're feeling the energy building in the nice little village of the Plains in Auburn. An interesting.
It's an away game though tomorrow,
yeah.
so.
Well, an inter-Austrian. You know, we've got Auburn versus Baylor on Friday, so some Klein versus Jonathan Newman action going on there. But we will not be breaking down the college football lineup. We will be talking about some of the most noteworthy events, and it has been full stop on that side of things every day with a new headline. And so we'll start today's show with a major topic of conversation. This has been, I think, building for a few weeks now, if not a few months, but the Trump administration taking an equity claim into Intel, which is, they're justifying it based off of Biden administration policies regarding the CHIPS Act. There is discussion about further moves in this. There has been larger discussions about a sovereign wealth fund. It's been a good time to be giving away Hayek books, since a lot of Hayek commentary out there from those warning about the dangers of that. And if you have not gotten your copy of Hayek for the 21st Century, you should do so right now at Mises.org/Hayek21. That's Mises.org/Hayek21, as in 21st century there. Great book. Free, thanks to our donor drive. But that being said, Connor, you have an article this week on this very topic, so I will open it up to you and let you take this in the direction that you would like.
Yeah, so I wrote about this mainly because of the reaction, the reaction to the deal. And just to run over it really quick, because I think that the story of it's sort of insightful in some ways. From all indications, it looks like this was another example of Trump watching Fox News, or in this case, Fox Business, and it then, generating federal policy as a result. So he was watching a morning show there. There was a segment where the host was going over some concerns that China hawks in Congress, specifically Josh Hawley, I think, had raised about the CEO of Intel, and how, with his background, he may have had some connections in the Chinese military. And so people went and connected it. And 5 minutes after this segment airs, Trump put some post out on Truth Social about how this guy needs to be, he needs to step down immediately. He said something like, there's no other solution for this. It has to happen immediately. And then Intel freaked out. They reached out to the White House. They got a meeting organized. So the CEO flew out there, and they sat down. Turns out there were other solutions to this. Trump basically agreed to back down on this public threat. Threat maybe isn't the right word, but this demand for him to step down. But in exchange, he wanted 10% equity share in Intel. And of course, Intel agreed to this. It was announced last Friday, I believe. But Trump, of course, is celebrating this. He loves anything that's like deal making. That's kind of his thing. And he is really trying to bolster support for this by bragging that he paid no money for it. And as you sort of mentioned before, the reason he's able to kind of say that is because the money used in this specific deal was allocated from the CHIPS Act, which was signed under Biden. So he's, of course, acting like this is some amazing deal. And there's some other details that kind of glossed over in the article about how they want to do this with other companies, and it looks like a sovereign wealth fund is the goal here. And there are plenty of things to say about that, but specifically, I wrote this article because people were freaking out that this was like fascism or like socialism, and it's like that there is something to that for sure. We're not a fan of either of those, but I thought it was important to maybe not remind people, the people that are regular readers of Mises.org or are serious listeners of the show know this, but for people that maybe they're talking to are people sort of outside of our circles, it's an important thing to drill down that like heavy government involvement in the economy is not a new thing. This is not some unprecedented like leap into, you know, a fascistic corporatist economy. The history of that is extensive and it goes back over a century. And I just wanted to sort of drill down and make that point. But yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of different angles to this story, and that was the specific one I wanted to focus on.
Yeah, you know, I had the benefit of looking over and editing Connor's article before it went out, so which I always enjoy doing. But we actually got a couple of articles on this after the fact, kind of coming at it from some different angles. It is telling, and I think this is probably true for lots of our political elites, but you know that Trump came to this by watching TV, so kind of just his shoot from the hip, reactive kind of thing as style, which sometimes can land in our benefit, and a lot of times is just it doesn't have a lot of depth of thought behind it. But I thought the way that it was phrased, even just in the teaser of the article, was that this is really just a rebrand. As long as Trump can say it's his, it doesn't really matter what the policy is or does. It doesn't matter if it was borrowed from Biden. It doesn't matter. And this is honestly just like a reflection of just the big beautiful bill. He runs on, we're going to cut spending, we're going to cut all these things. No, we're going to do more than ever, but it's going to be big and beautiful and all this. So the way I kind of saw it as I was reading, Connor focused in on the element that this isn't, you know, it is kind of like fascism, but it's just another form of interventionism. But it's others have brought up that it's moving toward that kind of like sovereign wealth fund. And I think the most annoying thing about it is Trump has this mindset that a lot of people actually have, the paradigm that the government is us and that the government is we. So he says, we, you know, I didn't give up anything. We spent this money. We got this awesome deal and we have a 10% stake and we're going to make this money. Same with tariffs. Oh, we're going to get all this beautiful money from tariffs. Well, no, if tariffs bring in revenue or this company brings in revenue, the government gets more money. You know, like Trump was being excited about back in the 1800s, they had a government surplus. That just means they taxed and had more money than the government knew what to do with. It didn't mean the American people were any better off. It was actually the opposite, because the money was in the hands of the government. So, I mean, they really need to, you know, Rothbard was key on that, with breaking that paradigm that the government is not us. We are not better off because the government has a 10% share stake in Intel or any other business.
No, absolutely. You know, I think, Connor, your angle there, I think is a great one, because I do have to roll my eyes a bit when I see people. Again, I agree with the core, you know, idea, right? Like, you know, this is a troubling policy, right? This is, you know, this increasing line to the sort of state capitalist model. But, you know, when I see people kind of leaning on, oh, well, you know, he's ignoring mainstream economists, and I see even libertarians, I see even, like, you know, Austrian aligned folks explicitly talking about, like, oh, well, Trump and his economic advisors, you know, are just hostile to mainstream economics, this, that, and the other. Like, this is exactly the road that we have been on for decades, right? You know, we can have, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had on whether an equity stake is worse than a direct subsidization of an industry, which is what the CHIPS Act was. To make it clear, because I saw some people on social media, you know, we were against the CHIPS Act, we are against this. But if you are part of a profession, or when you know, there was the broad consensus that, oh, well, something had to be done on the chimp front, the same way that something had to be done bailing out, you know, various, you know, name your Wall Street bank here during 2008, something had to be done to do this, that, and the other. Well, then don't be surprised when inevitably you get more explicit action here. And I think the broadening of scope of this is interesting and troubling. Again, I see a lot of the companies being suggested as who might be next in this order, all kind of similarly, I think, fall in the range of, you know, these companies that are receiving CHIPS Act funding, kind of keeping within that sector as part of this program. But again, don't be surprised when we have, already glossed over the lines between private and public, where that component gets more explicit here. And so that there's just been a long building momentum for this by, again, the mainstream of the economic profession and all of the fallacies that have been built in here. One of the things I think is kind of interesting, though, is that like these are precisely the warnings that the Institute has been making for decades, right? You go back to the 90s, and you'll find, Lou Rockwell and Murray Rothbard, and it was the Austrian scholars that were warning about, our increasing step into economic fascism, if you will, and that position at that time, was being, was attacked. Oh, you're being radical, you're being extremist, you're being fringe, whatever. Everything's great, but like this is precisely the course of events that have been building up to decades of policy that had become accepted. And unless you're going to have a fundamental radical reevaluation of what the role of state and private industry should be, unless you really orientate things towards recognizing the clear distinction that needs to be made off of property rights and kind of the divide between state and banking, state and private business and banking and everything that goes into it, don't be surprised when this is what it looks like. And I think there's another interesting component to it where, this has been the drumbeat for the left for quite some time of like, oh, well, fantasizing of just imagine if America could have a more Chinese modeled economy. Now we're kind of seeing it more on the right. And I think there's some valid, concerns about it coming from both sides now. But again, this has largely been accepted. This has been baked into where we've been going on a trajectory for quite some time.
Right, and it's that's how I sort of see it as the status quo is a trajectory. It's this trajectory of growth of the government and growth of, the amount of interventions out there. And that is sort of like, this is a theme that we've touched on in the show over and over again, because it's kind of the same theme for a lot of different stories. They're trying, like the media is freaking out about what Trump's doing and acting like he's coming in and just shattering precedent, when all he's doing is just taking what was happening before, taking that same trajectory and rebranding it as his own. And so like we're attacking from the other side there, because it's like he ran as like this big disruptor, and all we're getting is the same thing. And then that's the other like component, and this is a good example of it. It's like all these MAGA types are just acting like they will be in power forever. And that's just like, that is very, very, very unlikely, to put it kindly. And so what you're going to have is like, if they build up all these stakes in all these different companies, they're just going to be handing those over to the government or to the Democrats, to back to the establishment, to the extent that the establishment doesn't already run it right now under Trump. And so it's just like, it's just very disappointing. After, not that I really let myself get too excited about like this big, disruption that was coming during the campaign and like a lot of the rhetoric. I was skeptical. I'm happy I was skeptical, but it's very frustrating to be in the thick of it right now. And this is just yet another example.
Do you have anything else to add, Josh?
Well, I think also just the point about the tying back to the CHIPS Act, and this ties to stuff with like Taiwan, right? And that they can make the microchips. Is that right? I mean yeah. So somebody was making the point the other day that everybody asks, oh my gosh, Vivek Ramaswamy was making this a big point as well, that we've got to, this also ties into foreign policy. We've got to go to war potentially with China, another giant nuclear power, over Taiwan if necessary. But the Taiwanese are treated like this magical people or magical place that are the only people in the world who know how to create microchips, where really microchips could be made lots of places. There's comparative advantage and all that, which is fine. But if we rolled back the government interventions, laws, taxes, inflation, microchips could be made in America or anywhere else. And if they're so important, then how about we scale it back? But it's always more interventions forward and more involvement of the state. And then when that causes other problems, amazingly, the free market that doesn't exist in its pure form is blamed, and more interventions are the result. And so, and both the left and the right agree on that for different reasons.
One thing I think is interesting, just for a historical overlap, is it's kind of interesting. We've seen this a lot online of late. I think even Chris Rufo was it Bill Maher or something like that, where he talked about how like Nixon's going to be vindicated. And it's like there's definitely like, there's definitely a vibe, there's definitely a social media sort of trend about, base Nixon and this sort of stuff. And like Nixon himself, very interesting character. Like, we can have a separate conversation about Watergate as a deep state coup. Murray Rothbard actually has some very interesting articles on that, where he kind of accepts like, this was kind of an interesting deep state operation to remove Nixon. But there is another aspect here, though, that I think is very interesting. And actually, I think it was earlier this year, maybe in February, we released an old lecture or a talk that Rothbard gave. And the title was Anarcho-Nixonism. And the NEP, which is like the new economic policy, and like the point that Rothbard was making, that I think has a lot of interesting overlap with just the current political zeitgeist, is that he was responding to, at the time, a lot of libertarians in his orbit, even a lot of young 1970s early ANCAP Rothbardians, whatever, who were very much attracted to Nixon for a variety of reasons. And that, he was watching how like Nixonian policy plays out. Like, they're always reassuring like behind the scenes, like, oh, well, don't worry. Like, he says this, he says that, but like behind the scenes, he's actually really smart. He's really interested in these ideas. There's a lot of kind of actually interesting scholarship about like, Nixon as classical liberal and that sort of stuff that, is worth considering. But like Rothbard's point was that, Nixon in power has this very much this grab bag of economic policies, that there is no cohesive economic theory guiding what Nixonianism is. Nixonianism is this use of power. It is kind of a proto version of you can just do things. And so you had price controls, obviously had going off the gold standard as one of the big ones that we talk about. But there was all these various aspects, and you had all of these people that were center-right economists defending these sort of policies with the belief that, this is just what was needed to be in the moment. And the NEP aspect of it was derived from Lenin's new economic policy that was just kind of just, we're throwing out orthodox Marxism. We're just going to kind of throw everything out there. Everything's going to be underneath the state. We're going to pull whatever we can. And like, I think there's a lot of interesting parallels. And again, it's reflected even in memes in the social media space of this sort of just this view of political power, political will, these short-term measures. We got to do whatever we can to prop up this, prop up that, whatever. Again, it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. Of course, the record for Nixon's new economic policy did not turn out very well, right? Stagflation and everything that we got in the 70s. We'll see if there's any reoccurrence there. Maybe that's better than reevaluating late 1920s, 1930s, and things like that. That's a conversation to be had. But I've been thinking about over these last couple of weeks, like Nixon, Rothbard's lecture on Nixon, because I think there's a lot of interesting parallels as we sit here in the year 2025.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also think another component is that whole like only Nixon can go to China effect. Like Trump is very sensitive to that. You saw that especially in his first term. I mean, he was incredibly hawkish against against Russia, specifically with Ukraine. I think in large part because of all the Russiagate stuff and the fact that we're trying to frame him as this agent of Russia. But you actually look at how he governed, and no, he was quite hawkish. He's the one that changed the aid to Ukraine from basically just money to like weapons and sending rockets and different weapon systems there. And that's like an example of, and the only Nixon can go to China effect is basically the thought that only really like Republican politicians can do left-wing things without really facing any criticism because their supporters are not going to criticize them, and the left won't criticize them either, and vice versa. And Trump is very sensitive to that for sure. And in this case, that was sort of the opposite from our perspective, because like the fact that that Nixon was engaging with China and willing to, use his words as a positive, but Trump has absolutely been pressured in the wrong direction. It's easiest to see on foreign policy, but yeah, he's very sensitive to that effect.
Well, moving on to another article from our roundtable. There's a lot of stuff going on in MAHA space, CDC space, and Josh, you have an article on that touches on public policy and a bit of the nutrition component, and that is definitely tied into the broader RFK MAHA zeitgeist that has been a major force of the conversation here the last several years. There's also some interesting personnel things that are going on with some of the bureaucracies now under Secretary Kennedy and the like. But I'll let you open up with what the content of your article is, and then we might be able to take it in a few different directions that go directly with the headlines.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my article was originally going to be titled "Inflation and MAHA," which I can't say that MAHA without kind of giggling, because I always think of like the Amanda show we grew up with. But anyway,
throwback.
I changed it to inflation and food debasement because I didn't really get into the public policy RFK side of that. That being said, it does overlap. It does touch. So that was in my mind, and then kind of tying back to what you talked about kind of the Nixon connection. One of the reasons that we should still criticize Richard Nixon, among many, is that closing of the gold window, which there was inflation since 1913, the creation of the Fed, of course, funded World War I and all sorts of things related to that, the Great Depression. But it really went off the rails after 1971. And I was reading another article, and there's a whole website basically saying, well, what happened in 1971? And it's sympathetic to Austrian ideas, and some of it is more you could argue is correlation versus causation. But they have a lot of interesting charts showing increases in all sorts of things that you wouldn't even expect. Things even like not just debt and stuff, but decreases in like food and certain foods and that are more nutritious, arguably, like meat consumption, and more increases in things like soy, or other things of that nature. So my article is really dealing with more of the economics and side of it, and it's actually inspired from two sources, but Jeff Degner's book on inflation and the family. He has a couple. I read that and then did a review last week for Mises.org, and then found some interesting points where he raises this point, or talks about it in a footnote, but doesn't explore it in the book, which is talking about how inflation, price inflation, just affects what people buy, but also affects the different choices and subsidization of food and things like this. That affects nutrition, which affects fertility, affects just health in general, and all sorts of things. So he was tying that to family formation. And so my second source of inspiration was from, in Isaiah, where it talks about, your silver has become dross, meaning impurity, and your wine has become diluted with water. And so the connection between debasement of the commodity metal, which silver, was maybe not used at that time quite yet as a monetary metal, but similarly was as a barter good that was measurable. And it was that directly tied with the dilution of food. And so I was kind of like, well, is this true? Is this really a valid connection? And so I tie in my article to basically talking about, there's price inflation, which if there's price inflation of food, which basically was one of the big things that affected the 2024 election, that was a big one. And Kamala even talked about price controls on grocery stores and all these certain things. But by definition, increases of the price of food means that you have to change your consumer choices in some way. Even if you buy the same food at higher prices, you're sacrificing elsewhere. But then I tie in, some of the history of during the 1970s. Ironically, because of the price increases in food, Nixon appointed this guy to the as Secretary of I think it was Agriculture Department, and his last name is Butts. He's not Seymour Butts, but anyway, Earl, and he basically was going to take all that easy money and subsidies and funnel that to big farms, and said basically get big or get out. And so all these farms started major industrial farming and getting into cheaper crops. and using the soil more and all these things. And smaller farmers got squeezed out of that competition, which meant the bigger farmers bought up their land. So they consolidated the market on behalf of larger farmers. And then they subsidized certain foods. And I also learned this week that the measurement of, we know there are problems with the CPI index of measuring inflation. But I didn't realize that the core CPI measures inflation, but it doesn't measure, it leaves out food and energy. And so the inflation rate, and Paul Krugman has done this before, inflation's not so bad as long as you don't look at food and energy. And they say, well, that's because it's so volatile. It's like, yes, it's so volatile because of, those are the areas that are largely hit with price inflation. So then I borrowed from an article from Jonathan Newman about shrinkflation, where the product literally, they offer less for the same amount of price. So there's a lot there, but just tying into MAHA, the whole thing, and RFK, my problem is what I call at the end this interventionist paradigm or interventionist mindset that, like, I am glad RFK is where he is versus someone else, but he and others are still in that interventionist mindset where the government interventions have to be the answers to these problems we see in health. And so he's really joining already the people he disagrees with on their terms and their presuppositions, and saying, okay, well, I agree with you. Hey, by the way, did you know Fruit Loops in Canada don't look like the Fruit Loops here? Let's ban this or that thing. Okay, so his mindset is still in that interventionist framework. And I kind of conclude at the end, if you don't have sound economic theory and you don't tie that in with monetary theory, you keep running into misdiagnoses and then counterproductive solutions. And I just want to read a couple quotes from some of these articles that talked about inflation hurting the poorest families, which it is true. It's inflation, price inflation, and monetary inflation hurt the most vulnerable. But this is the type of mindset we're dealing with. And I'm actually reading this with sympathy, not saying, not trying to own, people who I disagree with. I'm actually saying they're not getting the problem. And so I read this quote from this one article that said, how inflation is hurting the diets of low-income Americans. It says, despite government programs encouraging and subsidizing healthy foods, the problem is only growing. So they admit, like, the government is intervening, and the problem is getting worse. But their only answer is that it has to do more or do more differently. And so while I'm happy RFK hopefully is cleaning some house at the CDC, I think there needs to be a total paradigm shift of, that the government needs to intervene for Americans to be healthy or have healthier food. I think it's actually the opposite. Because of decades of government intervention, our food is less healthy. Our wine has become water, and we're bearing the effects in our health.
Connor, what do you have to add?
It's such a huge topic. This is a topic I'm very passionate about, and it's all because it's like exactly what you said. I think a lot of it comes from the fact that a lot of these MAHA people are former leftists. They still have this interventionist idea that if, there's just a handful of interventions that if they can just craft it correctly, then these problems go away, when in fact the problem is the same that it is in a lot of other industries where decades and sometimes centuries, in this case over a century, of policy has all been crafted and built on top of each other. And it's all designed, or it all makes the most sense if you think it was designed to move as much of our money into the pockets of agricultural companies, of drug companies, of healthcare providers, basically all different parts of this industry and these cross industries. It's all a giant racket, and it's a racket built on past policies. And so the only way to actually effectively address this problem is to roll back those past policies that this whole thing is built on top of. And at some points, it seems like MAHA, the RFK especially, seems to understand that. But I actually wrote a whole article about this, I think last year, that laid out how this whole racket, or outlined how the racket works. And he tweeted it out. And he had one problem. I think at one point, he thought I demonized the healthcare system a little too much. So I guess I'm more MAHA than RFK. But so it's like he, amplified this. He seems to at least grasp some of this, but the movement as a whole, and certainly the specific policies so far, seem to be a lot more what you're talking about, Josh. It's like, let's leave all this in place and just ban this food dye. And it's like once again, I'm quite passionate about this. I'm not like a huge defender of food dye. I don't like the government coming in and banning things and making those decisions for everybody, but I'm not nearly as upset about that intervention as I am with like a lot of other interventions and a lot of other things that the government is doing. But it's the same thing. And I guess I'm kind of a broken record on the show because it's the same thing over and over again. It's just disappointing. You kind of have what feels like this paradigm shift. You have RFK coming in, Jay Bhattacharya, and the COVID stuff and some of the vaccine stuff is a little bit different. We're talking much bigger here, but it's like it just doesn't really seem like we're going to have the paradigm shifting results that they were like celebrating back when the election happened.
Well, that's what will be interesting, just to see how much of this direction, how much of this change in tone results in lasting change, which almost necessarily will require non-political action. And so I think so much of this stuff, right, is that you've had decades after decades after decades. Again, some of this fuels into, again, the critiques that we were just talking about in terms of just the set of policies that has been kind of baked into the American government ideology for quite some time. The perversion of economics as discipline, the perversion of just everything becoming political. And here, I think this is what motivates so much of Trumpism, similar to, again, what motivated a lot of Nixonism, right? Nixon was a backlash in many ways to the cultural changes of late 60s and things like that, and people seeing that we kind of needed to have, a strong figure to punch back at some of these folks. Well, that is, I think, certainly a part of the animating dynamic that you have with the current form of Trumpism, is that, people are sick and tired of, seeing their, real economic standing, go away, of, seeing the quality of their food go out there. There's certainly heightened awareness about, reevaluating some of these decisions. And again, I'm not surprised when they see politics as the one major tipping point that has changed things in a certain direction, that everything becomes something that needs to be solved with a political tool. Even having the president of the United States talking about the Cracker Barrel's disastrous rebranding and things like that. And so it is going to be interesting to see, I think there's, what the temporary political movement looks like now. And again, I do think there's certainly something that resembles a vibe shift that goes beyond simply the politics, right? You are seeing some of that a little bit with like the Steak and Shake move, right? And we can have a broader conversation about a fast food burger joint changing from beef tallow from seed oils. Like, is that really some sort of great victory for, healthcare panaceic outcomes there? Maybe not. There's also kind of the fun tie-in of the Steak and Shake owner being like the critic investor on the Cracker Barrel situation in particular, like the way there's some interesting investor drama going on that particular thing with those two kind of stars aligning there. But I think you definitely see a little bit, a lot more from a corporate angle of a desire to recognize, maybe 50%, 51%, 53% of the country that is sick and tired of a way that a lot of these concerns are not being heard, not being considered, or are being pushed through. Maybe that will reconcile in ways that will go just simply beyond politics. But there is the other interesting side of this, which is this disruptive force component to it, which plays into Trump's impact on the Fed. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. It comes into some of just the rotation of elites. Elites might be overstating it. I mean, we're talking ultimately, a lot of technocratic folks, and I don't want to give them the prestige of being considered an elite by our standards here. But some of the headlines that have come up with RFK, just this week, is more people at the CDC. A lot of these longtime institutional folks that were able to survive the rotation, the change of the administration there. We had the active, someone who was serving as the active director of the CDC, who then became the Trump appointee, who was kind of seen as a more moderating force there. There's kind of interesting claims that she's resigned and she hasn't resigned, and we'll see how that goes and whatever. Kind of sounds like a federal governor situation. And in some ways there has been this sort of interesting moderating influence on RFK. I mean, I've seen people on social media like Nicole Sharon and some of those folks who are very interested on more of the holistic approaches, particularly on food, right, with the different ways of like agricultural techniques itself. Some of the things that Thomas Massey has talked about as well. Like there was, I think, genuine interest with a lot of those folks in some of those more kind of deeper systemic things that obviously can't be, not necessarily talking about monetary policy reforms necessarily, but some of these things that go beyond simply the restriction and the banning of certain products, X, Y, and Z. But it seems like a lot of that early energy was being stymied by, I think, Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, who was kind of one of the questionable votes on RFK's confirmation in the first place, might have had like a moderating influence in some of the early decisions there. Based on some of the stuff, like maybe Cassidy's influence is waning and you're going to kind of get like peak RFK, whatever that looks like in the coming months. We'll stay tuned to that. But I think it goes to, I think, this more larger dynamic, and I think it's easy and understandable for people like us that recognize the state itself, is, the ultimate source of a lot of these problems, right? Recognizing the consequences of the cost of monetary policy, not only in the inflationary component, but the shrinkflation component of it, and we see these very systemic problems that the state plays a role in, and we recognize the very short-term, haphazard ways that some of these current interventions going in. But I can understand why, there's a lot of people that are sick and tired of this and recognize, okay, well, here we are stacking things that seem like wins, and some of them might prove to be short-term wins. Some of them might end up creating new problems that'll create other things down the road, right? But I can have sympathy too, why there's so much interest in, so much buy-in into using these tools right now, given the extent, again, our long-running theme of it's been decades of crap policy that have created the conditions for where we find ourselves right now.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point too, that it almost has to be a counterculture thing. Like the political part of this is one part of it, and it's an important part. It's what we tend to focus on, but it's like at the end of the day, like your household is determining like what you buy at the grocery store, what you eat. And these have been struggles that, go back a long time. Like it's not easy to avoid, the super addictive processed foods. Like that stuff feels good and it tastes good. And like that's a personal battle that everybody has to go through to some extent. And, and that's why I think it's interesting. I hadn't really considered the monetary policy angle of this before, but it's like very tied in with time preference. Like there is kind of a monetary angle within your life where if you eat the cheap, super addictive stuff right now, that's probably going to generate much larger medical bills down the road, but that's way in the future. So there's like an interesting kind of high time preference angle to all that. And it's not like all of this stuff is like just coming from the state. This is a struggle that everybody has to go through and has had to go through for a long time. But it really does matter when the government comes in and, starts nudging people in an unproductive direction. And then that nudge is continuing and building for decades and decades and decades. And like clearly things have happened. I mean, like people are always talking about what happened in 1971. But what I remember from that article I wrote was that in the 70s, the chronic disease rate in the U.S. was at like 1%. And today it's over 222 million Americans. So it has exploded. And it's not like that is only because of monetary policy. I'm not saying that. But monetary policy absolutely it plays a role in terms of, nudging people towards a higher time preference, kind of kicking the can down the road, not dealing with their problems, not making the right decision right now. It nudges people in that direction. When all of this stuff is already such a struggle, that can really compound over time. And then you add on to that all of the other non-monetary regulations on top of that. So yeah, that's important. But like they're still nudges at the end of the day. And so like if there's this broader counterculture movement to like just eat healthier, be healthier, we can still we don't need to wait for all these policies to be rolled back, which is something I'm not very convinced is going to happen in the near term. You're right. Like if there's a cultural movement, that's sort of what MAHA is at its best, is that kind of culture. Like, hey, we're going to be rejecting this stuff that's been pushed on us, because in a lot of ways we can. I think that's a really important amount of point of nuance to have with this discussion.
Right. I think there was this meme that was kind of funny, but I think it actually does make an important point. Right after Trump got elected and RFK was appointed, or it may have even been before, it doesn't really matter when it was, but it was, the girl goes to the refrigerator and pulls out a Coke and then closes it and has a picture of RFK on the fridge and then goes, never mind, puts it and takes out a water. So there is the personal choice component. But it's, I would say it's actually more than nudges of monetary policy. I think it is that, but it's more that money in a modern economy where we use money, I was going to say a modern monetary, but I didn't want to confuse it, it pervades everything that we do. And so it's unsurprising that money would have an impact on these areas, and when you tamper with the money, it will have effects elsewhere where the choices have to be changed. However, there is nobody, in a sense, RFK is not coming to save you, so you and I have to make those choices. So it's actually an area where it's like sometimes it's a little bit weird because you feel like you have to argue against different sides of the argument to be a libertarian, but I think it's coherent where it's like, I don't care if people want to eat McDonald's and Fruit Loops. I don't really know, exactly if somebody wants to be a vegetarian or somebody wants to eat only meat. I have to kind of figure that out in my own life, just like everybody else does. But what I do know is that the artificial choices that monetary inflation causes and then restricts, it debases not only the money, but debases the products. And then the price inflation has to, affect people's choices because people don't have an unlimited amount of money. So, I mean, if something is higher price, you either have to sacrifice to get it or make sacrifices elsewhere in your life. So even if we didn't take, all the other more detailed aspects, just the fact of price inflation in food or anything else affects people elsewhere in their lives. So I think there is a personal responsibility element of it for sure. But yeah, it has to be culturally it's not going to come from the top down, which is still the problem. That's what RFK's in the federal government is going to make that 330 million Americans healthy. Well, no, that's not going to take place. Not from one person making policy decisions.
Well, RFK might not save us, but maybe Jerome Powell will. That was kind of some of the effectively the de facto headlines from Jackson Hole. Of course, we're very, very much kidding, of course, make that very, very clear. But I know last week with Ryan, if he was here, I'd try to figure out some way of making a Bill Pulte reference, but he's not here, so we'll avoid that bit for this week. But you did have Jerome Powell at Jackson Hole. You did have Trump following through on what we discussed last week about him possibly firing Lisa Cook, the great scandal. I mean, how can we dare go on without the great intellectual prowess of Lisa Cook and all of her great work on monetary policy? So there is some Fed drama out there. And what's interesting is kind of the headlines. To me, like, this is kind of peak Fed, right? Fed speak itself is a key tool of monetary policy. You want to be as boring as possible. You want to make it seem, you want to make people to extrapolate from your words whatever outcome they want to desire. And I think Powell put on a master class of, cloaking, whatever he's trying to say in the most boring technocratic language as possible to get the outcomes that he wanted. And so when he was at Jackson Hole this past weekend was, of course, the big hubbub with all the fancy central bankers of the world uniting for, the common cause and human decency and, rainbows and kittens and all that sort of stuff. Powell's statements, comments seem to indicate, or at least a lot of people took away the indication that concerns over the labor market and whatnot might be opening the door to a upcoming rate cut, perhaps even next month. It seemed that even after the weekend, there was kind of people recognizing that maybe he wasn't quite saying that. Maybe there was new discussions about changing the way the Fed kind of looked at its framework to consider monetary policy decisions, moving away from certain elements there, certain variables that they had changed back in 2020. I think it was like right before COVID, something like that. But kind of, oh, don't worry, we're super serious. We're constantly reevaluating and tweaking the way that we interpret the data to make our highly proclaimed big solutions here. But again, this of course the constant political winds that have surrounded the Fed's decision are at the forefront here. There didn't seem to be, Powell was kind of saying, oh, well, I as chair do not dictate this sort of stuff. The governors, our broader board will make these decisions, right? Trying to separate himself as a singular force when it comes to making monetary policy decisions. And so it's going to be very interesting to see this play out again. Glad to see so much attention on the Fed. Glad to see the Fed being attacked from so many interesting ways right now. Again, I don't think it's ever been as much a mainstream topic of conversation as it is right now. But Connor, any takeaways from what we've seen this week in Fed Watch?
It's just sort of this broader story is just interesting to me, and I really am focused on the politicization that you're talking about there. And it's just interesting watching the reaction. And I guess this makes sense, but it seems like there is no way for them to escape the narrative at all that Trump is driving monetary policy. Even if they don't do what he wants, then like that might be seen by some people as them deliberately not doing what he wants. So even if they go the other way, they're not really going to escape that. And like already, like I think Trump made some comments the other day about how there's like a path to him getting a majority on the Fed board, basically a majority Trump Fed board, which is what I was talking about the other week with like the discourse about the Fed may be going in the same direction that the discourse with the Supreme Court does now, where all these board members are essentially just these agents of whatever president put them on there. And we're sort of at the point now where, okay, maybe the Fed cuts next in September in the coming weeks. But like that, it doesn't seem like there's sort of an off ramp for like the depoliticization of the Fed. That's tough to say. And that, as we've been talking about, that's a positive. And also, I did. There is another angle here too, where this does feel kind of inevitable at some point, just as the debt grows and as the effects of monetary policy just grow with it and become more and more ingrained in daily life. Like I think people are going to be paying more attention to the Fed. So there is a question of like, is Trump really the big driver here? I think he may be accelerating it a bit, and certainly like his specific call for the Fed to cut rates and their refusal to do that and making it a thing. And now the fact that they may do that, of course, will be read as like them relenting and giving into the pressure. Like he has already changed the conversation around the Fed in a way that we're generally in favor of because it's more clarifying. It's closer to the truth that like this is actually a politicized organization. So we're happy about that. Of course, we're not very happy with what Trump is trying to get the Fed to do, but that's something we've covered a lot before. But it's been interesting to watch specifically the reaction to Jackson Hole has really shown that like we're deeper into this politicization. Gosh, I really got to practice that word than I had really expected, and I'm happy to see that.
What say you, Josh?
Yeah, well, I know I'll always remember where I was when I heard that Lisa Cook was off the. No, I'm just kidding. But it kind of reminded me.
Pour one out.
Well, in this watching of Jackson Hole, there are two articles. There are actually quite a few actually right now on Mises.org on the Fed independence. Dr. Thornton wrote one about Jackson Hole, what was going on over there. And so his is good, and he did a follow-up podcast. And Jonathan Newman also wrote one on the myth of Fed independence, which was written before that, but plays into this. But I hadn't considered the fact that it is good in a sense that now that Trump is so publicly trying to throw his weight around with the Fed, that now people are saying, wait a second, that's kind of seeming like the Fed is political. It's like, well, yeah, it's like, if that's what it takes to wake people up to it, it's annoying to hear Trump asking for, the only thing he could ask for is more lower interest rates. And that's the only direction they can that they can go in. So it's interesting also with Jerome Powell is, let's say, okay, we're going to do this. We're looking at this thing. Well, maybe we'll do a cut this, but they always facilitate more easy money and credit. The only way that they finally get themselves into too much hot water is when they print so much money. Somebody will get on this and say, oh, we don't print money. But anyway, they digitally print so much money that you run the risk of hyperinflation or whatever else. The truth is that I think it's, we at the Mises Institute would like people to come around to is, number one, the Fed is and has always been political. It's always been a political instrument to have a hidden method of taxation through inflation, and that this it's kind of the same thing with the CDC and this public health dynamic as well. It's this pseudo science, this pseudo intellectual thing of, well, no, this is something that really takes experts, because this is something called monetary policy. They're really looking at all this and deciding what is the right interest rate, and monetary policy is a fraud. It's this idea of that the government or the government through the central banking system knows the right amount of artificial money and credit to push into the system, which we know causes price inflation, boom-bust cycles, and distorts the structure of production. But they also know how to do that to the right amount of full employment, but then they know how to do that to stop price inflation. And that's their sacred dual mandate, and, that they come around, and kind of wisely figure that out. It's in my head. Dr. Salerno says that they ambidextrously, with both hands, are able to manage these things. And no, it's always political. It's always about more easy money and credit. And usually, the only thing that you can get people to say bad about the Fed is, hey, did you know the Fed is a private institution? When it's nowhere near a private institution. As we know, it's chartered by Congress, appointed by the president. So I'm glad that it's in the news and negatively, but I think just kind of like with we mentioned, there has to be kind of a cultural change, an understanding of money and economics with the health dynamic. There has to be a cultural change, really a change back, because Americans, a lot more of them understood this in the early 1900s, of understanding what is actually going on when the Fed does this secret monetary policy thing, which monetary policy just means figuring out how much money they can print without getting in trouble. That's without getting themselves in trouble. They don't care if we get in trouble. So that's the desanctification of the Fed is really what needs to happen. So I'm glad Trump is doing that, but he doesn't have a sense of what's really wrong with the Fed.
Well, you mentioned some articles on The Wire about this. I wanted to highlight one other one by John Wolfenbarger. Powell cares more about Fed independence than inflation in the economy, which is a great breakdown of Jackson Hole. At the end, he's got some very nice little bullet points that I think sums up really the takeaways from the significance of it going forward. What does it all mean with the speech? That Powell will blame inflation on anything and anyone else but the Fed. He was talking about there's some references to COVID and tariffs, things like that. Pat himself on the back for being a genius central planner. That don't worry, they've got it all taken care of. Throw Trump and Wall Street a bone that he's open to cutting rates. It's always my fun dynamics is Wall Street. Stocks go up during an announcement like that, even though the underlying incentive, the underlying message is the employment rate or the employment situation is bad, so we might have to lower rates. But that's okay for Wall Street. Acknowledge that the Fed's rate hike may cause a recession, and after all, and that the latest job report may be signaling that. Ding, ding, ding. Justify the Fed's precious independence to raise or lower rates whenever they want based on how they interpret the latest data. And that the takeaway is going forward, that the Fed has no idea what it is doing or what to expect going forward, just like all economic central planners all over the world. Powell lacks the courage to stand up to Trump, not create more money out of thin air, even though they have failed for 52 months to hit their 2% target rate. And that Powell probably knows that more massive negative jobs revisions are coming on the September 6th jobs report. Stay tuned for that. Enabling him to cut rates on September 17th unless inflation is surprisingly bad. And again, I think that's exactly what we are heading with a lot of this sort of stuff. I mean, again, none of this should be surprising. Again, like the underlying metrics of the economy have not been particularly strong for quite some time. The whole purpose of kind of the Biden-era rate cut was a signal of this. And again, everything the Fed's trying to do right now is to just project competency, enough independence to show a kind of broader institutional strength, that we're not overly politicized, but also enough to not seem as a adversarial institution to the broader Trump portfolio. One thing I do think will be interesting going forward is that Stephen Marin, who is one of Trump's nominees on the table right now to fill one of the Fed spots that is actually open, he's got a lot of very interesting stuff. I don't know how much you guys have touched on. I've read his stuff, so I'm not going to put you guys on the spot. But just for our listeners to know, he has someone who has written a lot about what's called the Mar-a-Lago Accords. And the idea there was trying to tie broader aggressive tariff policy with a general devaluation of the dollar, with the viewpoint that the dollar is too overly weighted, that it is overly propped up globally, and that is the cause for a lot of the industrial moves out of the country, yada, yada, yada. And basically the explicit aim is that we need to weaken the dollar explicitly and use tariffs to force other countries to kind of accept that, and in terms of ramifications on debt and things like that. And it's just this very broad, ambitious, and frankly fairly dangerous plan. Obviously, Fed policies for quite some time have had the natural impact of being inflationary. You can pull up your favorite whether it's what the hell happened in 1971 or 1913, whatever your favorite, like the decline of purchasing power of the dollar meme that you have out there. That has been the de facto impact of all Fed policies for quite some time, but having it explicitly identified as an aim is a little bit different than what we are used to here. Again, not to give any of the current or former members of the Fed any credit there, but it will be interesting to see how much that explicit policy aim is reflected with other potential people that Trump is going to look to install here. We should have some indication on Lisa Cook front. I know there will be lawyers. I don't know how much. I would love to see the legal bills coming out of Fed battles on this topic. But it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out in the courts, whether Trump has the authority to do it, whether Bill Pulte will get what he wants, and using the mortgage fraud case against that particular Fed governor. But again, that's a lot of stuff going on here. There's going to be a lot of stuff to cover on power market for now in the near future. A lot of activity, a lot of changes. Again, it's again, to me, and I think the common thread of all of this is going to be, what does the economic environment look like 2 years from now? Because what I find so fascinating is that it was clear that so much of the mandate that came from 2024 was the direct result of inflation as one of the top drivers in politics. We hadn't seen obvious consumer price inflation along those lines since the 70s. It all comes back to Nixon in this episode. But that was a key driving force within that 2024 election. If we are on an inflationary track, if that pain returns, we're already seeing it play out, with core inflation and things like that. There's a lot of good reasons. I mean, Ryan McMakin has written a lot. There's no good reason to cut rates right now based on the underlying metrics right now. If we are dealing with an elevated inflation situation again in 2 years from now, what that is going to have in terms of the broader political sphere, where people are going to be looking for, okay, well, that didn't work. What comes next? I think that is a massive wild card in the general trends that when we have so much reevaluation of what does politics mean, what do these underlying cultural components, whether it's MAHA, whether it's whatever, what do people find as an answer? Is it going to be something better, or is it going to be something worse? It could very well be something worse. But I think the economic environment in the next couple of years is going to be, I think, have the opportunity to create a massive political shift in ways that I think are completely unknowable right now. The incredible amount of political uncertainty in ways that I don't think is really being touched upon with so much fixation on interesting topics, but congressional redistricting or some of these. If the economy sucks 2 years from now, all the current calculations from political consultants about what congressional races or presidential races are going to look like are going to be completely upended. And so that is something I think is going to be very, very fascinating as we see the way the Fed tries to manage the situation.
That's interesting about the Mar-a-Lago Accords. It reminds me of that Bill Buckley line that Rothbard attacked like early in his career about how basically the only way to beat the Soviet Union is to be more like the Soviet Union. Kind of feels like the same thing here with like the only way to beat China is to start acting more like the CCP. In my head I've christened these people economic neoconservatives because it's like the same kind of philosophy. But another quick point just to end on, if people are interested in that specific topic we were referencing earlier about how the Fed has always been political. Jonathan Newman, we just published on Mises.org. I guess it was from what's it called right now? The magazine.
Misesian,
yes, that's right. And his article going over how the Fed has never been an independent entity. Fed independence is a complete myth. And he went back and looked at the records. There's a specific meeting he touches on from 1951, which is like in the narrative is like when Fed independence was really, baked into the equation. And he just shows that all they did was change their rhetoric. It's based on the speech he gave at our revisionist history conference. And that's a really, I think, devastating takedown of the mainstream characterization of the Fed. So I recommend checking that out.
Josh, anything to add before we get out of here?
And the Fed.
There you go.
No, I don't have anything more to add than that.
Excellent. Well, if you want your own copy of the Misesian so that you can have the concrete version, I guess concrete would not make for a very good magazine material. But if you want your own version of the Misesian in paper for your desk, for your kitchen table or whatever your magazine's to dump on, you can do so just by becoming a Mises member. You can find more information on that at the Mises.org. And if you are a Mises member or interested in becoming a Mises member and want to hang out with Connor, Josh, and myself, do not forget that we have got a great event coming up in October on 16th through the 18th in beautiful Delray Beach, Florida. Our theme is Economic Freedom, the Key to Liberty. We've got an all-star lineup, including Dr. Salerno, Tom Woods, Bob Murphy, Peter Klein, Alex Paula, Guido Holzman, coming all the way from Europe, Per Byland, the Newmans, and all sorts of other great speakers. Again, you could find more information about that event at Mises.org/events. It will be a great time. It always is. Well, with that being said, enjoy your college football week for those who celebrate. For Connor O'Keefe, for Josh, this is Tho Bishop. We will see you next week. Proceed ever more boldly.